The flashbulbs were a symphony of adoration, and Bentley Ashford was its conductor. Each blinding pop was a note of validation, a testament to his arrival. On his arm, Isabella Monroe was the perfect accessory, a goddess sculpted from victory and silk, her youth a vibrant contrast to the life he'd left behind. He smirked, the familiar curl of triumph on his lips. This wasn't just an awards night, it was his coronation. He had shed his past, his mousy, unassuming ex-wife, and emerged reborn in the crucible of public acclaim. Tonight, he would not only claim his trophy, but also show the world, and most importantly her, that leaving him was the greatest mistake of her life. He was the victor. He was the headline. The air in the grand ballroom of the Carlisle Hotel was thick with the scent of money, ambition, and expensive perfume. It was the night of the 85th Annual Golden Quill Awards, the most prestigious literary event of the year, where authors were treated like movie stars and words were weighed in gold. Bentley Ashford breathed it all in a deep, satisfying gulp of the atmosphere he now considered his birthright. His novel, Echoes of a Faded Dawn, was the literary darling of the season, a sprawling, melancholic masterpiece that critics had hailed as a once-in-a-generation voice. He was the frontrunner for the coveted fiction prize, the pinnacle of authorial achievement. He ran a hand over the lapel of his Tom Ford tuxedo, the fabric smooth and impossibly black. Beside him, Isabella squeezed his arm, her smile as bright and dazzling as the diamond necklace gracing her collarbone. "They're all looking at you, darling," she murmured, her voice a low, sultry purr. "Let them look," Bentley replied, his voice laced with a practiced, casual arrogance. He scanned the room, a king surveying his court. He saw Jonathan Franzen holding court in a corner, Zadie Smith engaged in animated conversation near the bar, and Stephen King, looking surprisingly unassuming, chatting with a group of publicists. These were his peers now. He belonged here. The past 18 months had been a whirlwind of calculated brilliance. He'd left Liliana, his wife of 12 years, with a single clinical conversation in their book-filled, slightly worn-out brownstone. The reason he'd given her was a cliché, wrapped in intellectualism. "We've diverged, Elle. Our creative and personal energies are no longer aligned." The truth, of course, was Isabella. He'd met her at a university guest lecture. She was a graduate student, 24 years old, with wide, adoring eyes and an insatiable appetite for the life he could offer. She saw him not as Bentley, the man who struggled with deadlines and left his socks on the floor, but as Bentley Ashford, the literary genius. She was a reflection of the man he wanted to be, and he'd chosen the reflection over the reality. Liliana had taken it with a quiet, devastating stillness that had unnerved him more than any screaming match would have. She had simply packed her bags, her face pale and her eyes hollow, and disappeared from his life. Their divorce was swift and quiet, handled by lawyers. He'd heard through a mutual acquaintance that she had moved out of New York, somewhere upstate, to find herself, or some other such nonsense. He pictured her in a small, sad cottage, surrounded by cats, growing bitter and irrelevant. The thought gave him a small, dark thrill of satisfaction. He had been the sun in their shared universe, and without him, she was surely just a cold, forgotten rock. "There's Charles Kensington from the New York Times," Isabella whispered, nudging him slightly. "He gave you that rave review. You should go say hello." "In a moment," Bentley said, his eyes still scanning. He was a shark, and this room was his ocean. Every handshake, every nod, every shared laugh was a strategic move. He was building his brand, cementing his legacy. The award tonight would be the final immutable stone in the foundation of his new life. He and Isabella began their slow, deliberate procession through the room. Hands were shaken, backs were slapped, compliments were exchanged like currency. Bentley was charming, witty, and self-deprecating, in just the right measure, a performance he had honed to perfection. Isabella was his silent, beautiful echo, smiling graciously, her presence a constant, glittering reminder of his virility and success. "Bentley, my boy," a booming voice called out. It was Arthur Mason, his former father-in-law, and ironically, the head of the Mason publishing house, which had not published Echoes of a Faded Dawn. Arthur was a man built like a bulldog, with a gruff exterior that hid a shrewd business mind. "Arthur," Bentley said, his smile tightening almost imperceptibly. "Good to see you." Arthur's eyes flickered to Isabella, a quick, dismissive glance before settling back on Bentley. "Quite a night for you. I read the book. Powerful stuff." "Thank you, Arthur. That means a lot." "Yes, well," Arthur grunted, taking a sip of his scotch. "It had a familiar rhythm to it, a certain cadence. Reminded me of some of Liliana's early prose, back when she used to write." Bentley felt a flash of ice in his veins. He forced a laugh. "Liliana. Oh, she was a wonderful editor, a great first reader, but she never had the patience for the long haul. She was a sprinter, not a marathon runner." It was a line he'd used before. It neatly packaged Liliana's abandoned creative ambitions into a tidy, dismissible box. Arthur just grunted again, his gaze unreadable. "Well, enjoy your night, Bentley. You've certainly worked hard to get here." The words were polite, but the tone felt like sandpaper. Arthur turned and walked away, leaving Bentley feeling strangely exposed. "What was that about?" Isabella asked, a slight frown marring her perfect brow. "He seemed odd." "He's old school," Bentley said, waving a dismissive hand. "Still bitter I didn't sign with his house. And he's Liliana's father. Familial loyalty and all that." He quickly steered her toward the bar, eager to wash the taste of the encounter away with champagne. The lights in the ballroom began to dim, signaling that the ceremony was about to begin. Guests began to move towards their assigned tables. Bentley and Isabella were seated at a prime spot right near the stage, sharing a table with his agent, his publicist, and the editor-in-chief of a major magazine. The buzz in the room was electric, a collective hum of anticipation. Bentley felt his heart begin to beat a little faster. This was it, the culmination of everything. He reached under the table and squeezed Isabella's knee. She looked at him, her eyes shining. "You're going to win," she mouthed. He knew she was right. He leaned back in his chair, a picture of confidence, and allowed himself a moment of pure, unadulterated triumph. He had it all: the woman, the fame, the masterpiece. He was untouchable. He thought for a fleeting second of Liliana in her sad little cottage. He hoped with a savage sort of pity that she was watching the live stream, that she was witnessing his ascent. He hoped it was destroying her. It was then that a subtle shift occurred in the room's atmosphere. A quiet murmur started near the grand entrance, a ripple that spread outwards table by table. Conversations faltered, heads turned. The focused energy of the room suddenly found a new, singular focal point. Bentley followed the collective gaze, annoyed at the interruption. What could possibly be more important than the start of the ceremony? And then he saw her. The doors were being held open by two staff members, and framed in the doorway was a woman. No, not just a woman. She was a vision. She wore a gown of midnight blue silk that seemed to drink the light falling from her shoulders in a cascade of liquid elegance. A constellation of sapphires and diamonds glittered at her throat. Her hair, which he remembered as a simple shoulder-length brown, was now a rich, dark auburn swept up in an intricate style that showcased the elegant line of her neck. But it was her face that made the air leave Bentley's lungs. The features were the same, but they were rearranged, sharpened by a confidence so profound it was almost a physical force. The hesitant uncertainty he had known was gone, replaced by a cool, placid serenity. Her smile was small, subtle, but it held a universe of secrets. It was Liliana. His Liliana. But it was not. It was a complete stranger, wearing his ex-wife's face. The room was filled with a stunned, reverent silence, punctuated by the frantic, sudden explosion of flashbulbs from the paparazzi who had scrambled back to the entrance. They had missed her on the red carpet, a cardinal sin they were now desperately trying to rectify. Bentley sat frozen, his champagne glass halfway to his lips. He felt Isabella stiffen beside him. Who is that? She whispered, her voice tight with a mixture of awe and dawning apprehension. Bentley couldn't answer. His throat was a desert. His world, so perfectly constructed, so solid and certain just moments before, had developed a hairline crack. And then he saw the man whose hand she was holding. He was tall, dressed in a bespoke suit that was the epitome of understated power. His face was sharp, intelligent, with piercing grey eyes, and a stillness that commanded attention more than any boisterous display ever could. Bentley recognized him instantly, not from literary circles, but from the covers of Forbes and the Wall Street Journal. It was Damien Blackwood, the Damien Blackwood, the reclusive, mysterious tech billionaire, the man who had revolutionized data encryption, who owned half of Silicon Valley, and whose net worth was a figure with so many zeros it seemed fictional. A man who never attended public events. Ever. And he was here at the Golden Quill Awards holding Liliana Mason's hand as if it were the most natural thing in the world. He leaned down and whispered something in her ear, and Liliana laughed. It wasn't the quiet, breathy laugh he remembered. It was a full, melodious sound that seemed to fill the sudden silence in the room. The crack in Bentley's world widened into a chasm. This was impossible. This was a hallucination. Liliana, his quiet, mousy, irrelevant Liliana with Damien Blackwood. The narrative he had so carefully written for himself, the story of his triumph and her lonely demise, had just been ripped to shreds in front of the entire world, and on the biggest night of his life. The maitre d', flustered and awed, rushed forward to greet the couple. As they were led into the room, every eye followed them. No one was looking at Bentley Ashford anymore. The conductor had lost his orchestra. The spotlight hadn't just moved, it had been stolen by a ghost from his past resurrected and shining with a brilliance he could never have imagined. The silence in the ballroom was a living thing, a palpable pressure that had replaced the earlier buzz of excitement. It was the kind of silence that follows a lightning strike when the world holds its breath, waiting for the thunder. Bentley felt it in his chest, a heavy, suffocating weight. His mind, usually a rapid-fire processor of wit and strategy, was a blank, static-filled screen. Liliana and Damien Blackwood moved through the room with an unhurried grace that only amplified their magnetic pull. They weren't just walking, they were gliding on a current of their own making. The whispers started then, a sibilant tide rising in their wake. Is that Damien Blackwood? What is he doing here? And who is she? She's stunning. Wait! That's Liliana Mason, Bentley Ashford's ex-wife. That last exclamation, uttered by a well-known gossip columnist at a nearby table, was a gunshot in the quiet room. Heads swiveled from Liliana back to Bentley, their expressions a cocktail of shock pity and delicious Schadenfreude-fueled curiosity. Bentley felt hundreds of pairs of eyes on him, dissecting his reaction. He felt his face flush a hot, creeping tide of humiliation. He was no longer the man of the hour. He was a spectacle, a supporting character in a drama he hadn't known was being written. Bentley, Isabella hissed, her voice sharp with panic. Her hand was gripping his thigh under the table, her nails digging into the fine wool of his trousers. What is going on? Why is she here with him? I don't know. Bentley managed to choke out the words, tasting like ash. He took a gulp of his champagne, but it did nothing to quench the fire in his throat. The maitre d' was leading Liliana and Damien to a table. Not just any table. It was a specially prepared table for two, placed in a prime location that hadn't been there 10 minutes ago. It was a power move so blatant and yet so elegant that it was breathtaking. They hadn't come to fit into the evening. The evening was reforming around them. Damien pulled out Liliana's chair, a gesture of old-world courtesy that seemed utterly natural. As she sat, her midnight blue gown pooling around her, She let her gaze drift across the room. For a brief, heart-stopping moment, her eyes met Bentley's. There was no anger in her look, no hatred, no pain. There was something far worse, a calm, dispassionate assessment, the kind one might give to a piece of furniture or a distant, uninteresting memory. In that single glance, she dismissed 12 years of their shared life. She saw him, the man who had shattered her heart, and she looked right through him as if he were made of glass. Then she turned her attention to Damien, a warm, genuine smile gracing her lips, and Bentley Ashford ceased to exist for her. The thunder that followed the lightning strike was the collective exhale of the room, the immediate eruption of frantic, hushed conversation. Phones were already emerging from beneath tablecloths. The story of the night had irrevocably changed. It was no longer Bentley Ashford, literary genius poised to win, and it was now billionaire recluse Damien Blackwood makes shock public appearance with mystery woman, the ex-wife of his award-nominated rival. Bentley could already see the headlines, the salacious blog posts, the endless social media commentary. His publicist, a harried-looking woman named Chloe, leaned across the table, her face pale. Bentley, just stay calm. Don't react. We can manage this. Manage what? Bentley snapped, his voice louder than he intended. Manage the fact that my ex-wife just showed up with a man who could buy this entire hotel with his pocket change and is currently sucking all the oxygen out of the room. Keep your voice down, his agent, Marcus, cautioned, his eyes darting around nervously. This is a bad look, Bentley. A very bad look. Isabella was silent, her face a mask of confusion and betrayal. She had signed on to be the girlfriend of the triumphant victor, the star of the show. Instead, she was now the other woman, in a public humiliation. Her role had been downgraded from leading lady to a tawdry footnote. She looked from Bentley's angry, blotchy face to Liliana's serene, luminous one, and a flicker of something doubt, perhaps, or dawning comprehension crossed her features. The lights dimmed further, and a spotlight hit the stage. The host, a famous comedian known for his sharp wit, walked out to the podium. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the Golden Quill Awards. We have a lot of literary talent in the room tonight, and apparently... He paused, letting his eyes drift pointedly towards Damien Blackwood's table. Some serious venture capital, too. I guess the rumor is true, the publishing industry really is looking for a new business model. A wave of laughter, slightly strained, rippled through the room. The host had acknowledged the elephant, and in doing so, had cemented its importance. Bentley wanted to slide under the table. He felt a bead of sweat trickle down his temple. The ceremony began, but the proceedings were a blur to Bentley. Awards were given for poetry, for biography, for debut novel. Winners gave heartfelt, emotional speeches, but the room's attention was divided. Every few minutes, a surreptitious glance would be thrown toward Liliana and Damien's table. They seemed oblivious, lost in their own world. They spoke quietly. He would occasionally reach across and touch her hand, and they shared a bottle of wine that had been brought specifically for them, its label one. Bentley had only ever read about. He couldn't focus. The words of the speakers turned into a meaningless drone. The applause was a distant roar. His mind was a maelstrom of rage, jealousy, and a terrifying, unfamiliar feeling of helplessness. How had this happened? The Liliana he knew was quiet, intellectual, and deeply insecure about her place in the world. She was the one who edited his manuscripts, who organized his research, who reminded him of appointments. She was the scaffolding that held up his genius essential, but meant to be unseen. The woman across the room was a different species entirely. She radiated a confidence that came from deep within, a self-possession that no amount of money or fame could buy. It was the one thing he could never give her, because his own confidence was a fragile construct built on external validation. He remembered her writing. Arthur was right. There was a cadence in echoes of a faded dawn that was hers. He'd always told himself he was simply inspired by her, that he was elevating her raw, unformed ideas into true art. He'd read her journals, her abandoned short stories, absorbing her unique way of seeing the world, of phrasing a feeling. He saw it as a collaboration, albeit an uncredited one. He was the artist, she was the muse. But now, looking at the woman she had become, a dark, venomous thought slithered into his mind. What if he had it backwards? What if he was the parasite and she was the host? He pushed the thought away violently. It was absurd. He was the genius. The critics had said so. The next award, the presenter on stage announced, is for the highest honor in American letters, the Golden Quill for fiction. This was it, the main event. Chloe put a reassuring hand on his arm. Breathe, Bentley. This is your moment. No matter what else is happening, this is yours. Bentley straightened his tie and tried to compose his features into an expression of humble anticipation. He felt Isabella's hand, cold and clammy, find his again. The nominees were read aloud. His name was last met with strong, enthusiastic applause, though it felt muted compared to the buzz that still surrounded Liliana's presence. The camera panned to his face. He smiled a tight, forced grimace he hoped looked genuine. The presenter, a celebrated actress with an Oscar on her mantle, tore open the envelope. The silence stretched thick and heavy. And the Golden Quill goes to... Bentley held his breath. His entire future, his entire sense of self, hung on the next few words. Catherine Park, for the last embers of winter. The world went white. For a moment there was no sound, only a high-pitched ringing in his ears. The applause that erupted for the other author felt like a physical blow. He saw Catherine Park, a quiet, unassuming woman in her late 60s, gasp and cover her mouth, tears welling in her eyes. Her table erupted in joy. His table was Sant. Chloe's hand fell from his arm. Marcus stared at the stage, his face grim. Isabella simply let go of his hand, her touch retreating as if he were suddenly contagious. Bentley clapped. He had to. He was on camera. The motion was mechanical, wooden. His face felt like a plaster mask that was about to crack. He had lost. On the night his ex-wife had returned from the dead to publicly humiliate him, he had lost. It wasn't just a defeat. It was an annihilation. His eyes against his will were drawn back to Liliana's table. She was politely applauding the winner, a small, serene smile on her face. She hadn't even looked at him. His failure was as irrelevant to her as his success would have been. Damien Blackwood leaned over and offered her his arm. She took it, and together they stood up. They had no reason to stay. They hadn't come for the awards. They had come for something else entirely. As they began to walk towards the exit long before the ceremony was over, they passed his table. For a moment, Liliana was only a few feet away from him. He could smell her perfume, a subtle, complex scent of sandalwood and night-blooming jasmine. Nothing like the simple lavender soap she used to wear. She didn't look at him. She didn't look at Isabella. Her gaze was fixed forward. But as she passed, she turned her head slightly, and her eyes met Isabella's. It was a fleeting look, but it was filled with a universe of meaning. It wasn't a look of triumph or pity. It was a look of profound quiet, almost sorrowful understanding. It was a look that said, I know him, and I am so sorry you have to learn what I already know. And then she was gone, a phantom of midnight silk and diamonds, leaving a trail of shattered expectations and whispered questions in her wake. Bentley Ashford was left sitting in the glare of the stage lights, a loser at a table of ghosts, the deafening sound of another woman's victory speech echoing in the ruins of his perfect night. The remainder of the awards ceremony was a slow, agonizing torture. Bentley sat through the final speeches and the closing remarks, a frozen smile plastered on his face, while a black hole of rage and humiliation churned in his gut. The air at his table was thick with unspoken condolences and the stench of failure. His agent Marcus avoided his eyes, furiously typing on his phone, likely already in damage control mode. Chloe, his publicist, kept offering him water with a funereal solemnity. Isabella was a statue of ice beside him. She had withdrawn completely, her vibrant energy extinguished. The diamond necklace that had looked so triumphant earlier now seemed like a glittering noose around her neck. She had hitched her wagon to a falling star, and the reality of her predicament was dawning on her in real time, in a ballroom filled with the most influential people in their world. When the ceremony finally ended and the lights came up, a cage of politeness descended. People from other tables began to approach. Tough break, Bentley. Catherine's book was a surprise, but a worthy one. You were robbed, Ashford. Absolutely robbed. Better luck next time. Echoes was a masterpiece. The words were meaningless platitudes, the social lubricant required to move past an awkward moment. Bentley knew what they were really thinking, what they would whisper about the moment they were out of earshot. They weren't just talking about him losing the award, they were talking about him losing everything. He had been publicly upstaged, cuckolded, not by a rival author, but by a titan of industry, and his carefully crafted persona had been shattered. The after-party was being held in an adjacent salon, a swirl of jazz music, clinking glasses and loud relieved chatter. Normally, Bentley would have been in his element here holding court, accepting congratulations. Tonight, the thought of entering that room felt like marching to his own execution. I'm not going, he said to Marcus, his voice low and tight. You have to, Marcus insisted, his face strained. If you disappear, you look weak. You have to go in there, hold your head high, congratulate Catherine Park, and act like you don't have a care in the world. It's the only play we have. Isabella finally spoke, her voice thin and brittle. I have a headache. I think I'm going to go home. She didn't look at him. She was already detaching, creating distance. Fine. Bentley snapped his control, fraying. Go. He didn't care. At that moment, she was just another part of the evening's spectacular failure. She flinched as if he'd struck her, then turned and walked away without another word, melting into the crowd, heading for the coat check. Her retreat was another public wound, another drop of blood in the water, for the sharks to scent. Steeling himself, Bentley followed Marcus towards the after-party. As he stepped through the archway, a wall of noise and forced merriment hit him. He felt intensely conspicuous, as if a spotlight was following him, illuminating his shame. And then he saw them. They hadn't left the hotel. Liliana and Damien Blackwood were in a secluded alcove of the salon, speaking with a small select group of people. Bentley recognized them instantly. Michael Linton, the chairman of a major Hollywood studio, and Ari Emanuel, the notoriously powerful CEO of the talent agency WME. This wasn't a social call. This was a business meeting disguised as a casual chat. The sight sent a fresh wave of venom through Bentley's veins. It all clicked into place. This wasn't a random act of revenge. This was a strategic, calculated strike. She hadn't come here just to upstage him. She had used his night, the platform he had built, as a launchpad for her own ambitions. She was leveraging the attention, the buzz, the sheer shock of her appearance with Damien Blackwood to make deals with the most powerful men in entertainment. He couldn't stand it. The injustice, the sheer audacity of it was more than he could bear. His ego, bruised and bleeding, demanded action. He needed to reassert control, to puncture the serene, untouchable bubble she had created around herself. Ignoring Marcus's frantic whispered, "Bentley, don't!" He broke away and began to walk towards the alcove. As he approached, the conversation paused. 4 pairs of intensely powerful eyes turned to him. Michael Linton and Ari Emanuel looked at him with mild professional curiosity. Damien Blackwood's grey eyes were cool and unreadable, as impenetrable as a fortress wall. Liliana's expression was one of mild, weary surprise, as if she were spotting a persistent insect she thought she'd already swatted away. "Bentley," she said, her voice even. There was no warmth in it, just acknowledgement. "Liliana." He began, forcing a smile that felt like a snarl. I must say I'm surprised to see you. I didn't think literary awards were quite your scene anymore. I pictured you more upstate, with a garden. He gestured vaguely, trying to paint a picture of the quaint, irrelevant life he had imagined for her. Liliana's smile didn't waver. People change, Bentley, and gardens require patience. It turns out my talents were better suited to a different kind of cultivation. Her eyes flickered briefly towards Damien and the other men. Bentley pressed on, fueled by a desperate need to land a blow. And you've certainly found a powerful benefactor. He let the word hang in the air, weighted with insinuation. He glanced at Damien Blackwood, a direct challenge. Damien, an unexpected pleasure. I wasn't aware you were a connoisseur of modern fiction. Damien Blackwood didn't rise to the bait. He simply inclined his head slightly. I'm a connoisseur of brilliance, Mr. Ashford, in any form it takes. His gaze rested on Liliana with an admiration so genuine it made Bentley's stomach clench. And Liliana is one of the most brilliant people I've ever met. The compliment was delivered with such quiet sincerity that it completely disarmed Bentley's insinuation. It wasn't a boast, it was a statement of fact. Bentley turned his attention back to Liliana, his voice dripping with condescension. Well, I'm glad to see you've landed on your feet. After everything, I was worried. This finally seemed to elicit a flicker of a real emotion from her, a spark of something that looked like pity. You were never worried, Bentley, she said, her voice soft, but carrying a devastating clarity. You were relieved, there's a difference. The truth of it hit him like a punch to the gut. Michael Linton and Ari Emanuel were now watching the exchange with undisguised interest, their predator's instincts sensing a story far more compelling than any manuscript. I only ever wanted what was best for you, Bentley lied, trying to regain his footing. No, Liliana corrected him gently. You only ever wanted what was best for you. You just needed me to believe it was for me. It was a neat trick. For a while. She paused, then delivered the killing blow, a verbal coup de grace. The thing you never understood, Bentley, is that I wasn't the scaffolding holding you up. I was the foundation. And when I left, I took it with me. I just hope for your sake that what you built on top of it isn't as hollow as I suspect it is. Every word was a perfectly aimed dart. She had just articulated his deepest, most terrifying fear and laid it bare in front of these titans of industry. The cadence, she had mentioned the familiar rhythm Arthur Mason had noted. It was all tied up in that one word, hollow. He was speechless. His wit, his arrogance, his entire arsenal of verbal weaponry was gone. He was standing there, exposed and empty-handed. Damien Blackwood stepped forward slightly, a subtle but unmistakable move to end the conversation. Gentlemen, he said to Linton and Emmanuel, his voice calm and commanding, I believe we were discussing the film rights. Film rights. The words barely registered. Bentley. Damien said, his grey eyes finally locking onto his with a chilling intensity. Congratulations on your nomination. It's a significant achievement, to be recognized for your work. It was the most brutal insult of the night. The bland, polite, utterly dismissive congratulations of a superior being. He was swatting Bentley away, not with anger, but with indifference. He was dismissing him as a minor nuisance, a footnote to their far more important conversation. Bentley felt a hot flush of shame so intense it was dizzying. He had come over to reclaim his power to inflict a wound, and instead he had been dismantled piece by piece with surgical precision. He hadn't just lost the battle, he had been erased from the war. He mumbled something incoherent, a pathetic excuse for a retreat, and turned. As he walked away, he heard Ari Emanuel's distinct, gravelly voice pick up the conversation as if he'd never been there. So about the protagonist, Ari said. The story of a woman finding her voice after being silenced. It's powerful. We see a major star in the role. The narrative arc is incredible. Bentley froze. They weren't talking about his book. They were talking about hers, about her life, about the story he had tried so hard to erase. His humiliation was now complete. He was not only the villain in her story, he was a footnote in the lucrative deal being made about it. He stumbled through the crowd blind to the faces deaf to the music and fled the party, escaping into the cold, indifferent New York night. The next morning, Bentley awoke to the aggressive grey light of a New York hangover. His head throbbed in time with the city's distant sirens. The tuxedo from the night before was crumpled in a heap on the floor of his sterile minimalist apartment, an apartment he'd chosen specifically because it was the aesthetic opposite of the warm, cluttered brownstone he had shared with Liliana. Isabella was gone. There was no note, just an empty space on the pillow beside him, and the faint, lingering scent of her perfume, a ghost of his failed triumph. He stumbled to the kitchen and fumbled with the espresso machine, his hands shaking. He needed caffeine, but what he really craved was validation. He needed to see his name in print, to see the narrative of the night spun in his favor. Perhaps some critics would argue he was robbed. Perhaps the focus would be on his literary merits, not the red carpet drama. With a trembling finger, he tapped open the browser on his phone. The New York Times, the arts section. The headline was a punch to the face. Blackwood's surprise appearance at Golden Quills fuels Hollywood speculation. Liliana Mason, ex-wife of nominee Ashford at center of mystery deal. His name was there, but only as a subordinate clause, a piece of identifying information for the real star of the story, Liliana. The article barely mentioned his book or his loss. Instead, it was a breathless piece about Damien Blackwood's unprecedented appearance, accompanied by a stunning photo of him and Liliana. They looked regal, powerful, a modern-day power couple. There was a smaller, unflattering, candid shot of Bentley, caught mid-sentence as he confronted them, his face tight with anger. He looked petty and small. He clicked on another link, a popular culture blog. The headline was even more brutal. Awkward night for author Bentley Ashford as ex-wife steals show with billionaire beau, then he loses top prize. The article was a gleeful blow-by-blow account of his public humiliation. It quoted anonymous sources from the party who described his meltdown and Isabella's hasty exit. It was filled with speculation about Liliana and Damien, painting her as a mysterious phoenix rising from the ashes. He threw his phone across the room. It clattered against the wall and slid to the floor, the screen dark. He was trapped. The narrative was out of his control. He had spent his entire career mastering words, bending them to his will, to create fictions that the world adored. Now, the unassailable truth of reality reported in a million pixels and gallons of ink was crushing him. He paced the apartment like a caged animal, the silence pressing in on him. This was Liliana's doing. It had to be. This was her revenge, meticulously planned and ruthlessly executed. The quiet, mousy woman he thought he knew had been hiding a Machiavellian strategist. But a deeper, more unsettling thought gnawed at him. Liliana's words from the night before echoed in his mind. I was the foundation, and when I left, I took it with me. Hollow. The word clung to him. Driven by a masochistic impulse, he walked into his pristine office. The walls were lined with bookshelves, but they were mostly for show. The real work happened on his sleek iMac. On a stand beside it, propped up like a holy relic, was a hard copy of Echoes of a Faded Dawn. He picked it up. The cover, with his name in bold embossed letters, felt alien in his hands. He opened it to a random page. It was a passage that critics had universally praised for its raw emotional insight into the protagonist's grief. The silence in the house was not an absence of sound, but a presence. It had weight. It settled in the corners like dust clung to the curtains and slept in the hollow of her side of the bed. It was the ghost of a language we no longer spoke, a dialect of sorrow I had to learn to translate alone. He stared at the words. They were beautiful, they were powerful, and they were not his. A memory sharp and unwelcome pierced through the fog of his anger. A winter afternoon, years ago, Liliana curled on the old armchair in their brownstone, a mug of tea steaming beside her. She wasn't writing a novel, just journaling something she did religiously. He'd asked her what she was writing about. Just trying to describe the quiet, she'd said, her voice soft. After my grandmother passed, the silence in her house. It's not empty, you know. It's full. It's like a presence. He had stored that away. That idea. That feeling. He had taken it. He frantically flipped through the book, a cold sweat breaking out on his skin. Page after page, he saw her. Not just her ideas, but her very voice, her unique turn of phrase, the specific, idiosyncratic rhythm of her prose that Arthur Mason had recognized. There was the description of the falling autumn leaves as a slow, rust-colored surrender. That was from a poem she wrote in college and had pinned to the corkboard above her desk for years. There was the protagonist's habit of organizing her books by the emotion they evoked, not by author or genre. That was Liliana's quirky system, something he used to tease her about. The central metaphor of the novel, the echoes of a past life that shaped the present, was the core theme of an unfinished short story. She had let him read a story. She had abandoned after he'd told her it was a little too sentimental, a bit naive. He had lied. He'd seen its potential, its power, and he had discouraged her so he could claim it for himself. He had convinced himself it wasn't theft. It was inspiration. It was alchemy. He was the genius who could take her raw, unrefined emotions and shape them into art. He was the sculptor, and she was the clay. But looking at it now, stripped of his self-delusion, he saw the truth. He was a plagiarist, not of another published author, but of a private life. He had stolen the soul of his own wife and sold it to the world as his own. The book wasn't a masterpiece. It was a meticulously crafted forgery, hollow. The truth was a physical sickness. He stumbled to the bathroom and wrenched his body, trying to expel the poison of his own deceit. When he was done, he gripped the sink, staring at his reflection in the mirror. The man looking back at him was a stranger. His face, which yesterday had seemed handsome and successful, now looked gaunt and haunted. His eyes were filled with a desperate, panicked fear. He finally understood. Liliana's revenge wasn't the public spectacle at the awards night. That was just the opening act. Her true revenge was this moment, this private, solitary reckoning. She didn't need to expose him. She knew that his success was built on a lie so profound that it would eventually consume him from the inside out. She had let him build his gilded cage and then simply walked away, leaving him to realize he was trapped inside it alone. His phone buzzed from the other room. He ignored it. It buzzed again and again. A frantic, insistent rhythm. Finally driven by a sliver of desperate hope that it might be Isabella calling to reconcile, he retrieved it from the floor. The screen was cracked, but it lit up with a string of texts from his agent Marcus. "Call me now. A journalist just contacted me. A guy named Marcus Thorne. No, not me, another Marcus. He's asking about your early drafts. He's asking about Liliana's old writings. Someone talked Bentley. He says he has copies of her journals. Bentley, for the love of God, call me. What the hell is going on?" The blood drained from his face. It wasn't just a private reckoning anymore. The ghost he had tried to contain within the pages of his book was breaking free. The foundation Liliana had taken with her was beginning to crumble, and the entire hollow edifice he had built was about to come crashing down on his head. Bentley awoke to the aggressive grey light of a New York hangover. The tuxedo from the night before was a crumpled heap on the floor of his sterile minimalist apartment. Isabella was gone. There was no note, only an empty space on the pillow beside him, a ghost of his failed triumph. He stumbled to the kitchen, his hands shaking, bypassing the espresso machine for his phone. He needed to see the narrative to find some spin that might salvage his pride. He found none. The headlines were a public execution. The New York Times, Blackwood's surprise appearance at Golden Quills, fuels Hollywood speculation, Liliana Mason, ex-wife of nominee Ashford at center of mystery deal. His name was a footnote. A culture blog was more brutal. Awkward night for author Bentley Ashford as ex-wife steals show with billionaire beau, then he loses top prize. The article featured an unflattering candid of him confronting Liliana. His face tight with anger, making him look petty and small. He hurled the phone across the room, the clatter of its impact, a pathetic echo in the vast, silent apartment. The narrative was out of his control. He paced the room like a caged animal, Liliana's words from the party ringing in his ears. I was the foundation, and when I left, I took it with me. Hollow. The word clung to him. Drawn by a masochistic impulse, he walked into his office. There on its stand like a holy relic was a copy of Echoes of a Faded Dawn. He picked it up, the cover with his name in bold letters, feeling alien in his hands. He opened it to a random page, a passage praised by critics for its raw emotional insight. The silence in the house was not an absence of sound, but a presence. It had weight. It settled in the corners like dust. A dialect of sorrow I had to learn to translate alone. He stared at the words. They were beautiful, and they were not his. A memory pierced through his anger, sharp and unwelcome. Liliana, years ago, curled in an armchair, telling him about the quiet in her grandmother's house after she passed. It's not empty, she had said. It's full. It's like a presence. He had taken it. He had taken her grief and called it his genius. Frantically, he flipped through the book, a cold sweat on his skin. Page after page, he saw her phrasing, her metaphors, her soul. The protagonist's habit of organizing books by the emotion they evoked. That was Liliana's quirky system. The central theme of Echoes was from an unfinished story he'd told her was naive, so he could mine it for himself. He had convinced himself it was alchemy, that he was the artist elevating her raw material. But stripped of his self-delusion, he saw the truth. He was a plagiarist, not of a book, but of a life. The masterpiece wasn't his creation. It was a forgery of his wife's soul, hollow. The truth was a physical sickness. He stumbled to the bathroom and wrenched his body, trying to expel the poison of his own deceit. He gripped the sink, staring at his reflection. The man looking back was a stranger, his face gaunt and haunted. He finally understood Liliana's true revenge. It wasn't the public spectacle. It was this private, solitary reckoning. She had let him build his gilded cage and then simply walked away, leaving him to realize he was trapped inside it alone. His phone buzzed from the other room, a frantic, insistent rhythm. He retrieved it from the floor. The screen was cracked, but lit up with texts from his agent, Marcus. Call me now. A journalist just contacted me. Marcus Thorne. He's asking about your early drafts. He's asking about Liliana's old writings. He says he has copies of her journals. Someone talked Bentley. Bentley, for the love of God, call me. The blood drained from his face. This journalist wasn't a gossip columnist. He was a career ender. Bentley dialed, his hands slick. Tell me this is a joke, he whispered. I wish I could. Marcus's voice was grim. This guy Thorne has scans of Liliana's journals. He read me passages over the phone. They were verbatim Bentley. The silence in the house was not an absence of sound, but a presence. That exact line. He's giving us 24 hours to comment before he publishes. There was a damning pause. Is it true? Bentley's silence was his confession. Jesus Christ, Marcus breathed. We're done. My agency can't be associated with this. I'll release a pro forma denial, but after that, you're on your own. The line went dead. The final door of his professional life slammed shut, As if on cue, he heard a key in the lock. Isabella stepped inside, not with the hesitant air of a returning lover, but with the grim purpose of an undertaker. She carried an empty tote bag. "Isabella," he began. "Don't," she said, holding up a hand. She walked past him to the bedroom and began methodically collecting her things. "What are you doing?" he asked, his voice cracking. She faced him, her eyes clear and cold, all adoration replaced by a profound disappointment. "Last night," she said, when she looked at me, "your ex-wife, she didn't look angry. She looked sorry for me. I didn't understand it then, but I do now. She knew who you were, and she knew I was about to find out." A bitter laugh escaped her. "I was such a fool. I believed it all, the genius, the masterpiece. I thought I was part of your story, but I was just a prop you used to hurt her." "That's not true." He pleaded the words, sounding false even to him. "Isn't it?" she replied, her voice soft with a sad finality. "You don't love me, Bentley. You love how I made you feel. You love the reflection I showed you. But the man in that reflection isn't real." She zipped her bag and walked to the door. "Is the book a misunderstanding, Bentley?" she asked, her voice laced with a final chilling question. "Or is it just the one lie you finally got caught telling?" She didn't wait for an answer. She walked out, closing the door gently behind her. The soft click echoed the one from his phone call. He was utterly alone now, stripped of his award, his reputation, his agent, and his lover. He was just a hollow man in an empty apartment, waiting for the world to learn the truth. The story broke, not with a bang, but with the devastating precision of a surgeon's scalpel. Marcus Thorne's article in The Atlantic, titled "The Echo in the Room," laid Bentley's literary theft bare. It wasn't an accusation, it was an autopsy. Side-by-side comparisons of Liliana's private journals and Bentley's published prose were irrefutable. The piece was impeccably researched, quoting old friends who remembered Liliana's unique voice, and even her father Arthur Mason, who simply stated, "My daughter is, and always has been, a brilliant woman. I'm glad the world is finally getting a glimpse of it." The professional fallout was immediate and absolute. Sterling and Ross halted all printing of Echoes of a Faded Dawn. The Golden Quill Committee officially rescinded his nomination, and his name became toxic overnight. Bentley retreated into a self-imposed darkness in his apartment, a ghost in the life he'd built, haunted by the constant, silent pulse of notifications on his phone, each one another nail in his career's coffin. In stark contrast, Liliana Mason's star ascended. She remained elegantly silent on the scandal itself, a move that amplified her dignity. Her power move came a week later with the announcement of a major media deal. At its heart was her own memoir, its title, A Quiet, Brilliant Reclamation, A Different Kind of Dawn. She gave a single, poised television interview. She spoke with profound intelligence about the journey of finding one's own truth and the silencing of creative voices, but never once uttered Bentley's name. He was simply a chapter I have closed. Bentley watched from his darkened living room, finally understanding. Her power didn't come from Damian Blackwood or public revenge. It came from the unshakable confidence of someone who had survived a fire and knew with absolute certainty who she was. Months bled into a bleak winter. Bentley's finances collapsed under the weight of his disgrace. He was forced to sell the apartment, his art, and his designer furniture, the props for a life that was no longer his. He moved into a small, anonymous room, a nobody in a city that had once worshipped him. One afternoon, he saw her book displayed in a shop window. The cover was a simple, powerful photograph of Liliana, her gaze direct and strong. It was a #1 bestseller. With the last of his cash, he bought a copy and sat on a park bench, reading the final chapter. Her words were not for him, but they struck him with the force of a final judgment. "Some have called my story one of revenge," she wrote. "It is not. Revenge is a conversation with the past. I am only interested in a conversation with the future. Justice is not about punishing those who wronged you. It is about building a life so full and true that their chapter becomes an insignificant footnote. The greatest power is not to destroy, but to create. Bentley closed the book. A cold single tear traced a path through his unshaven cheek. It was a tear of pure annihilation. She hadn't just defeated him, she had transcended him entirely. He was the footnote, a faded echo. He was left with nothing but the truth in a profound and empty silence, the utter absence of the man he had pretended to be. And so the curtain falls on Bentley Ashford, a man who flew too close to a sun he did not create. His story serves as a chilling reminder that success built on deceit is a house of cards destined to collapse under the weight of truth. It wasn't the public spectacle or the loss of a trophy that destroyed him. It was the quiet, undeniable power of a voice he tried to silence. Liliana Mason didn't seek revenge in the traditional sense. Her victory was far more profound. She reclaimed her narrative, her art, and her life, proving that the most powerful spotlight is the one that shines from within. What did you think of Liliana's ultimate triumph? Was it poetic justice or something more? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. He was the man who gave up everything for her success. His dreams, his career, his future. When she was done with him, she cast him aside like a worn-out shoe. At a glittering New York gala, surrounded by the city's elite, she decided to humiliate him one last time, mocking the quiet, unassuming woman by his side. She thought his new date was a nobody, a downgrade. What she didn't know, what the entire room was about to discover in the most shocking way possible, is that his new girlfriend wasn't just anybody. She was an icon, an heiress to a global empire, and her name alone could bring titans of industry to their knees. Ethan Cole measured his life in shades of grey now. His bachelor apartment in Hell's Kitchen wasn't sad exactly. It was muted. The walls were a soft architectural grey, the furniture a collection of clean lines in charcoal and slate. It was a space of control, of quiet intention, a stark contrast to the life he'd lived for 12 years with Brenda Walsh. Their life together had been a vibrant, chaotic explosion of colour, mostly dictated by her. When they met, he was the rising star at Skidmore, Owings and Merrill, one of the most prestigious architectural firms in the world. He had a vision, a touch that could turn steel and glass into poetry. Brenda was a junior broker with a ferocious ambition that burned brighter than any skyscraper on the Manhattan skyline. He'd been captivated by her fire. She called his ambition artistic. She called hers necessary. The first sacrifice was small, a partnership track opportunity in the London office. "But my career is just taking off here, Ethan," she'd said, her hand on his chest, her eyes wide with earnest appeal. "I need you. We need you here." So he stayed. He designed from New York, pulling all-nighters, his name slowly becoming synonymous with brilliant but difficult concepts that other partners would ultimately take the credit for. Then came her big break, a chance to start her own real estate development firm. The seed money was immense. His savings, a small inheritance, and a loan against his future earnings provided the foundation. "It's an investment in us," she'd promised, kissing him, amidst piles of paperwork on their dining room table, the scent of her expensive perfume, Creed's Aventus for her, filling the air. He left some. He had to. Brenda's firm, Walsh Properties, needed an in-house consultant. In reality, he became her 24/7 fixer. He vetted blueprints, smoothed over zoning board issues with his technical expertise, and redesigned entire floor plans overnight to fit her ever-changing, profit-driven whims. He was the ghost in her machine, the silent architect behind her success. Walsh Properties boomed. They moved from a cozy West Village apartment to a sprawling penthouse on Park Avenue with panoramic views that made the city look like a carpet of diamonds. The colors grew louder, The parties became more lavish, the friends more transactional. Brenda traded her business suits for custom Chanel and her genuine laugh for a polished resonant sound deployed for networking. Ethan found himself fading further into the background, the man holding her coat, the quiet husband of the brilliant Brenda Walsh. The end came not with a bang, but with a quiet clinical assessment over a $500 bottle of Chateau Margaux she'd ordered. Ethan, we're on different paths now, she'd said, not unkindly, but with the detached air of a CEO analyzing a non-performing asset. My world, it requires a different kind of partner, someone who can keep up. The implication was clear. He, the man who had built the engine of her success, was now considered dead weight. The divorce was swift and brutal. Her lawyers, sharks from a top-tier firm, argued that his contributions were those of a supportive spouse, not a business partner. He was left with a settlement that felt more like severance pay, a fraction of the fortune he had helped build. He was forced to sign an ironclad NDA, preventing him from ever claiming credit for his work on her flagship projects. He was in essence erased from his own history, so now he lived in grey. He'd started his own small firm, Cole Design, from a corner of his apartment. His work was picking up small residential projects and consultations, but it was a quiet, solitary pursuit. The fire that had once driven him was now just a pilot light, flickering uncertainly. It was on a rainy Tuesday, seeking refuge in the Gagosian Gallery in Chelsea, that he met her. He was staring at an Anselm Kiefer painting, lost in its texture and raw historical weight, when a soft voice beside him said, "It feels like looking at a scar, doesn't it? A beautiful, terrible scar." He turned. She was wearing a simple beige trench coat, her honey blonde hair pulled back in a messy bun, with a few strands escaping, to frame a face that was arrestingly beautiful. But in a way he couldn't quite place. It wasn't the sharp sculpted beauty of the models in Brenda's magazines. It was softer, more soulful. Her eyes, a warm hazel, held a startling depth. She wore no discernible makeup. "That's the perfect way to describe it," Ethan said, genuinely surprised. "I was thinking the same thing." They fell into easy conversation. Her name was Fina, she said. Just Fina. She spoke about art with an unpretentious passion that he found intoxicating. She asked him what he did, and when he said he was an architect, her eyes lit up. "You build things. You make tangible art that people can live in. That's incredible." No one had called his work incredible in a long time. Brenda had called it a means to an end. They talked for 2 hours, wandering through the gallery, until the staff began politely hinting it was time to close. As they stood outside on the wet pavement, the city lights shimmering around them, Ethan felt a warmth he hadn't realized he'd been missing so profoundly. "I don't normally do this," he began, his heart thumping a nervous rhythm against his ribs. "But would you like to get a coffee sometime?" She smiled, a genuine, radiant smile that seemed to push back the gloom. "I'd like that very much, Ethan." She typed her number into his phone under the name Fina. Their first date was at a small, no-name Italian place in his neighborhood. She arrived in jeans, a simple white t-shirt, and the same trench coat. She seemed fascinated by his stories of architectural challenges, of balancing physics and aesthetics. She spoke of her own life in vague but intriguing terms. She traveled a lot for work and dealt with difficult personalities. He assumed she was perhaps a corporate art buyer or a consultant for a luxury brand. He never pressed. He was too busy enjoying the simple act of being seen, of being heard. He didn't Google her name. Fina was unique, but it felt private, a name just for him. He respected that. For the first time in over a decade, he was getting to know someone without a balance sheet attached. He wasn't Brenda Walsh's husband. He was just Ethan, and she was just Fina. It was a fragile, beautiful thing, and he was terrified of breaking it. After a month of quiet dinners, long walks through Central Park, and visits to obscure museums, Fina brought up the event. There's this charity gala, she said, swirling the wine in her glass at his apartment. The Children's Legacy Fund. It's a work thing. I have to go make an appearance. It's usually dreadfully boring. It would be infinitely less so if you were there with me. Ethan's stomach tightened. Ayla. The very word brought back a flood of memories, standing awkwardly in a tuxedo, while Brenda networked fetching her champagne, smiling vacantly at people who looked straight through him. It was Brenda's world. I don't know, Fina. That's not really my scene, he said, the excuse sounding weak even to himself. Please, she asked, her hazel eyes soft and pleading, just for an hour or two. We can sneak out early and get pizza, my treat. The thought of sharing a slice of pizza with her, after escaping a black tie event, was so incongruous so them that he couldn't help but smile. How could he say no? Okay. He relented. For you, but if anyone tries to talk to me about the commodities market, I'm faking a seizure. She laughed, a sound that filled his grey apartment with colour. It's a deal. He had no idea that he was agreeing to walk back into the very heart of the world he had escaped. He had no idea that Brenda would be there, and he had no idea that Fina, his quiet, unassuming Fina, was about to detonate a bomb in the middle of his old life, a bomb wrapped in Dior haute couture. The muted grey of his world was about to be shattered into a million brilliant, blinding pieces. Preparing for the gala felt like putting on an old, ill-fitting costume. Ethan rented a tuxedo from a place on Madison Avenue, the process feeling clinical and foreign. The last time he'd worn one, it had been a custom Tom Ford, a gift from Brenda for their 10th anniversary. A gift, he later realized, that was more about her image than his comfort. He remembered how she'd adjusted his bow tie. Her touch, not affectionate but proprietary, as if straightening a painting on a wall. Perfect, she'd said, looking at their reflection in the mirror. We look like $1 billion. He remembered feeling like a well-dressed accessory. This time was different. As he adjusted the standard-issue bow tie in his own mirror, he felt a nervous flutter. But it was for Fina. He wanted to look good for her. She'd told him she would meet him at the venue, the iconic Cipriani on 42nd Street, a grand, cavernous hall that had once been a bank. It's easier with traffic and work logistics, she'd explained vaguely over the phone. When Ethan arrived, the scene was exactly as he remembered and dreaded. A river of black cars flowed to the curb, depositing men in sharp tuxedos and women in glittering gowns. The air crackled with the sound of camera flashes from the press line, the murmur of powerful people greeting each other, and the clinking of champagne flutes. It was a pageant of wealth and influence. He took a deep breath, handed his invitation to the stern-looking woman at the door, and stepped inside. He scanned the cavernous room, a sea of black and diamonds under the impossibly high, ornate ceilings. He felt a familiar wave of alienation wash over him. Then he saw her. She was standing near one of the marble pillars, talking to an older gentleman, and she took his breath away. The simple, unassuming woman he knew was gone. In her place stood a goddess. She wore a gown of deep sapphire silk that seemed to drink the light. It was an architectural marvel in itself, minimalist yet impossibly elegant, with a single dramatic sweep of fabric falling from one shoulder. Her honey-blonde hair was styled in a chic, intricate updo, and delicate diamond earrings glittered at her ears. She was still recognizably his Fina, but she was also more. She radiated a poise and a quiet confidence that was nothing short of regal. He suddenly felt foolish for ever thinking she was just a corporate art buyer. As if sensing his presence, she turned. Her face broke into that warm, genuine smile that was just for him, and the goddess became Fina again. She gracefully excused herself from the man she was talking to and walked toward him. Hey you, she said softly, her eyes drinking him in. You look very handsome. A regular James Bond. And you, Ethan stammered. You look... I don't have the words. Stunning feels inadequate. She blushed, a faint pink rising on her cheeks. It's just a dress. all smoke and mirrors. Are you ready to brave the lion's den? With you, absolutely, he said, offering his arm. As she took it, he felt a jolt of pride. He wasn't an accessory tonight. He was her date. They found their assigned table, mercifully, in a slightly quieter corner of the room. Fina seemed to know a surprising number of people. Not in the way Brenda knew them, with aggressive handshakes and laser-focused eye contact, but in a more relaxed, familiar way. People would nod respectfully as she passed, their eyes widening slightly in recognition, but they kept their distance. It was odd. It was as if she was surrounded by an invisible barrier of respect. You seem popular, Ethan commented as they sat down. I've been coming to this event for years, she said, with a slight shrug. It's for a good cause. They made small talk, observing the glittering parade around them. Fina pointed out a famous actress, a tech billionaire, and a notoriously reclusive artist, telling Ethan funny little anecdotes about each of them. She made this intimidating world feel small and human. For the first time ever, Ethan was actually enjoying himself at a gala. He felt the tight knot of anxiety in his chest finally begin to loosen. He was so wrapped up in her, in the easy magic of their conversation, that he didn't see them approach. Well, Ethan Cole, I never thought I'd see you at an event like this again. The voice was like ice water down his spine. It was a voice engineered for public speaking and private condescension, a voice he had tried for 2 years to forget. He looked up. Brenda Walsh stood before them, a vision in crimson red sequins, a dress that screamed for attention. Beside her, preening in a velvet tuxedo jacket, was her new partner, Grant Harrison, a hedge fund manager, known for his ruthless takeovers and his collection of gaudy Swiss watches. His wrist glittered obnoxiously under the chandeliers. Brenda's eyes swept over Ethan's rented tux with a flicker of disdain before landing on Fina. She gave her a slow, deliberate, head-to-toe appraisal, her lips curling into a smug, pitying smile. It was the look she reserved for the catering staff. Brenda, Ethan said, his voice flat. He made no move to stand. I see you're back in the game. Brenda continued, her voice dripping with false sweetness. She ignored Fina completely, as if she were a piece of furniture. I'm so glad to see you're getting out. I was worried about you cooped up in that dreary little apartment. Grant chuckled, a moist, unpleasant sound. You gotta hand it to him, Bren. He's resourceful. Ethan felt a hot surge of anger. He could take her insults, he was used to them. But the way she was dismissing Fina, the woman who had brought light back into his life, was intolerable. Fina remained perfectly still, her expression unreadable. She simply watched Brenda, her hazel eyes calm and observant, which seemed to infuriate Brenda even more. Brenda thrived on reactions, on knowing her barbs had landed. Fina's serenity was a shield she couldn't penetrate. So, Brenda said finally, deigning to look at Fina, though not addressing her directly. She spoke to Ethan, her voice loud enough for the neighboring tables to hear. Is this your +1? It's sweet that you're trying, Ethan. Really? I know it must be tough starting over. Budgets are tight, I'm sure. She let the insult hang in the air, a poisonous cloud. The implication was clear. Fina looked cheap. She was a downgrade. The best a man like Ethan could afford. Ethan stood up at his chair, scraping against the floor. That's enough, Brenda. Oh, am I embarrassing you? She cooed, placing a hand on Grant's arm. Grant and I were just saying how important it is to maintain standards. In business, in life, in partners. She gave Fina another dismissive glance. You get what you pay for, after all. Before Ethan could unleash the torrent of furious words building in his throat. Fina moved. She placed a gentle restraining hand on his arm. Then she looked directly at Brenda for the first time. Her voice, when she spoke, was not loud, but it cut through Brenda's venomous aura with the precision of a diamond. It's a beautiful dress, Fina said, her gaze fixed on Brenda's crimson gown. Last season's Balmain, if I'm not mistaken. A bold choice. The comment was delivered so neutrally, yet it was a masterclass in subtle destruction. She had identified the design of the season, and with one phrase, a bold choice rendered it utterly passé. It was the kind of coded insult the women in this room used to destroy each other, and Fina had just wielded it with surgical skill. Brenda's smug smile faltered for a fraction of a second. She was momentarily thrown off balance. Who was this quiet little mouse to know Balmain? "And you are?" Brenda asked, her voice sharp and brittle. "My name is Fina," she replied, simply extending a hand. Brenda ignored the offered hand. "Fina, how quaint." The atmosphere was thick with tension. Ethan could feel the eyes of the people at the tables nearby. This was exactly what Brenda wanted, a public spectacle to cement her status and his humiliation. But something was wrong. Fina wasn't wilting. She wasn't intimidated. She was holding Brenda's gaze with an unnerving, tranquil power. The hunter had become the hunted, and she didn't even know it yet. The stage was set. The audience was watching, and the curtain was about to rise on a drama Brenda Walsh could never have anticipated. The standoff was a miniature vortex of social warfare in the grand ballroom of Cipriani. Brenda, accustomed to being the gravitational center of any room she entered, was visibly irritated by Fina's refusal to be diminished. Grant Harrison, sensing his partner's frustration, stepped forward with the clumsy swagger of a man who mistakes money for class. "Look," he said, directing his words at Ethan, but gesturing toward Fina. "It's a big night, lots of important people here. Maybe you and your friend should find a more appropriate venue. The donor list for this event is quite exclusive." He puffed out his chest, his watch catching the light. "We wouldn't want anyone to feel out of place." The insult was as subtle as a sledgehammer. "You don't belong here." Ethan's hands were clenched into fists at his sides. "We're exactly where we're supposed to be, Grant. Why don't you and Brenda go bother someone else?" "Protective Ethan? How noble," Brenda sneered. "It's a shame you didn't have that kind of fire when it mattered." She turned her focus back to Fina, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper that was intentionally loud. "A little piece of advice, honey. When a man has nothing, he'll cling to anything. Don't mistake desperation for devotion." It was a kill shot designed to poison Fina's mind against him, to paint him as a pathetic leech using a naive young woman to soothe his bruised ego. And that's when it happened. It started not with a shout, but with a gasp. A man walking past their table, a distinguished figure with silver hair and a sharp suit, stopped dead in his tracks. His eyes, wide with disbelief, were locked on Fina. "Mon Dieu!" He breathed the French exclamation, cutting through the ambient chatter. He rushed to their table, ignoring Brenda and Grant completely. He took Fina's free hand in both of his, bowing his head slightly, in a gesture of profound respect. "Serafina," he said, his voice thick with a Parisian accent. "What a magnificent surprise. I had no idea you were in New York. We thought you were still in seclusion at the villa in Como." Fina smiled warmly at the man. "Antoine, it's lovely to see you. I wanted a quiet evening." Brenda and Grant froze. The name Antoine registered first. Anyone with even a passing interest in high fashion or photography knew the name Antoine Levy. He was a living legend, the man whose lens had defined beauty for 3 decades. His portraits graced the covers of every Vogue, Harper's Bazaar, and Vanity Fair on the planet. For Antoine Levy to show this level of deference to anyone was unthinkable. Then the other name registered, Serafina. It was a name spoken in reverent tones in the circles Brenda desperately wanted to conquer, a name that was a brand in itself. Brenda's perfectly made-up face went slack. Her eyes darted from Antoine to Fina, the gears of her ruthlessly ambitious mind grinding, refusing to process the data. It wasn't possible. The woman in the simple, elegant blue dress, the quiet woman sitting with her pathetic ex-husband. It couldn't be her. Antoine, oblivious to the drama he had just ignited, continued to beam at Fina. Quiet evening, ma chérie. Your presence is never quiet. It is an event. You look breathtaking. Is this a new Dubois piece? Your father's work gets more brilliant every year. He gently touched the sapphire silk of her sleeve. The final piece of the puzzle slammed into place with the force of a physical blow. Dubois, the Dubois family, the French dynasty that owned a global luxury conglomerate. Their empire encompassed everything, from the world's most exclusive haute couture house, Dubois, to Parfums Dubois, to a portfolio of vineyards, art collections, and five-star hotels. They were old-world royalty, a level of wealth and influence that made new money players like Grant Harrison look like children in a sandbox. And Seraphina Dubois, she was the face of it all, not just an heiress, but a cultural phenomenon, a supermodel who rarely walked the runway anymore because she didn't have to. A woman so iconic, so elusive that her every public appearance was a global news story. She was known professionally by her first name alone, Seraphina. The face of the legendary perfume L'Étoile du Soir. The muse for her father, the reclusive design genius Jean-Luc Dubois. A woman who dated princes and artists, who was photographed with world leaders, and whose net worth was estimated in the billions. This was the woman Brenda had just advised not to mistake desperation for devotion. The woman whose date she had pitied. The woman she had just essentially called a cheap escort. The blood drained from Brenda's face. The crimson of her dress suddenly looked garish and desperate against her now ashen skin. She looked at Seraphina Dubois, and for the first time she saw her. She saw the regal poise, the quiet confidence, the subtle but priceless diamonds, the bespoke gown that wasn't last season's Balmain, but a one-of-a-kind creation from the most exclusive atelier in the world. She had been so blinded by her own arrogance, so eager to humiliate Ethan, that she had been functionally blind. Word was spreading like wildfire. People who had heard Antoine's exclamation were whispering, pointing. Phones previously tucked away were being subtly raised over shoulders to snap photos. The low hum of the room was changing its frequency, reorienting itself around their table. A bubble of silence and awe was expanding outwards. The famous actress Fina had pointed out earlier was staring, her jaw slightly agape. The tech billionaire was murmuring to his wife. Grant Harrison looked like he'd been tasered. His face was a comical mask of shock horror and frantic calculation. He was a man who lived and died by status, and he had just mortally insulted one of the most powerful figures in that universe. He looked at Brenda with pure, unadulterated panic. Brenda, to her credit, tried to recover. It was a valiant but pathetic effort. She forced a brittle, horrifying smile. Seraphina Dubois. My goodness, what an honor. I'm Brenda Walsh of Walsh Properties. We are such admirers of your family's work. Her voice was an octave too high. The change from sneering condescension to fawning sycophancy was so abrupt it was sickening. Seraphina's gaze was cool. She didn't retract her hand, which Brenda now desperately wanted to shake, nor did she acknowledge the introduction. She simply looked at Brenda, held her gaze for a long, silent moment, and then turned her full attention back to Ethan. She squeezed his arm gently, her eyes full of a soft, apologetic light. I'm so sorry, Ethan, she murmured, for his ears only. I really did hope for a quiet evening. That small, intimate gesture was the final, devastating blow. In that single moment, Seraphina Dubois, the global icon, had dismissed Brenda and Grant as if they were nothing more than a temporary annoyance, a piece of lint to be brushed aside. She had publicly and unequivocally aligned herself with Ethan. The message to Brenda and to the entire watching room was crystal clear. This is my man. You are nothing. Brenda stood frozen, her hand still hovering in the empty space between them. The flash of a photographer's camera from across the room illuminated her face, capturing a perfect high-definition image of utter and complete humiliation. The Queen of Park Avenue had just been dethroned in the middle of her own court, not by a rival, but by the quiet girlfriend of the man she had thrown away. The rest of the evening was a blur for Ethan. The moment Serafina's identity was revealed, their corner table became the epicenter of the New York social world. The gala's host, a formidable society matriarch named Beatrice Vanderbilt, descended upon them. Her initial annoyance at the commotion melting into effusive warmth the moment she saw Serafina. "Serafina, my dear girl, you honor us. Why didn't you tell me you were coming?" She boomed, air-kissing her with practiced ease. Her eyes flickered to Ethan, no longer with indifference, but with intense, speculative curiosity. Ethan felt like an exhibit at the zoo. People no longer looked through him. They stared at him, their expressions a mixture of awe, envy, and confusion. Who was this man? How had he a relative? Nobody captured the attention of Serafina Dubois. He saw men who had previously ignored him, now nodding in his direction, their wives whispering behind their hands. Brenda and Grant had vanished. They had simply dissolved into the crowd, retreating in a state of shock. Ethan caught a glimpse of Brenda's crimson dress near the exit, her posture rigid with fury and shame. The image was deeply satisfyingly cathartic. Serafina, with a grace that Ethan found astounding, navigated the sudden onslaught. She was polite but firm. "Beatrice, it's lovely to see you, and this is my partner, Ethan Cole," she said, her voice clear and proud. She put a subtle emphasis on the word partner, leaving no room for misinterpretation. She introduced him to Antoine Levy, to a senator to the CEO of a major investment bank. To each of them, she presented him not as an accessory, but as her equal. After 20 minutes of this suffocating attention, she leaned in close to his ear, her breath warm against his skin. "Remember our deal," she whispered. "I'm officially bored of this. Let's go get that pizza." And with a final polite nod to their host, she took his hand and led him not toward the main entrance, but through a side door near the kitchens. A sleek black Audi A8 with tinted windows was waiting the driver immediately stepping out to open the door. The level of discreet efficiency was staggering. Inside the plush leather interior of the car, as it pulled silently into the New York traffic, Serafina let out a long sigh and kicked off her diamond-encrusted heels. She turned to him, her face etched with concern. "I am so sorry, Ethan," she said, her voice laced with genuine regret. "That was the last thing I wanted to happen. I wanted you to meet my world on my terms, not like that. Not with her." Ethan looked at her. The goddess from the gala was gone again, replaced by the warm, caring Fina he'd come to know. "You have nothing to be sorry for," he said, taking her hand. "But, Serafina Dubois, the face of l'Étoile du Soir, I think I have a bottle of your perfume in my bathroom that Brenda left behind." She winced. "Let's throw that one out. I'll get you something better." A small smile played on her lips. "I wanted to tell you, I loved being just Fina. With you, I felt like I wasn't a brand or a name. I was just a person. It was the most real thing I've felt in years." "You're still just Fina to me," he said, and he meant it. "The rest is just noise." He paused. "Though watching Brenda's face when she realized who you were, I admit that was a pretty spectacular bonus." Serafina laughed a full, genuine laugh that echoed in the car. Her face was quite a picture. I almost felt sorry for her. "Don't," Ethan said, a hint of the old bitterness creeping in. "She wouldn't feel sorry for you." They got their pizza from a hole-in-the-wall place in the village, and Serafina, still in her couture gown, ate a slice folded in half on the curb, while Ethan, in his rented tux, laughed beside her. A lone paparazzo, who had somehow tracked them, snapped a photo from across the street. The next day, that photo would go viral. The Heiress and the Architect Serafina Dubois' downtown date night. It was a far more powerful statement than any red carpet appearance. The fallout was immediate and seismic. By 9 a.m. the next morning, Ethan's phone and email were exploding. Old colleagues from some who hadn't spoken to him in years were reaching out to reconnect. Headhunters from top architectural firms were suddenly interested in his boutique design philosophy. His small firm, Cole Design, was featured in a page 6 sidebar titled, "Who is Serafina's Mystery Man?" But the most shocking communication came from Brenda. It was a long, rambling text message sent at 3 a.m. "Ethan, I can't stop thinking about last night. Seeing you there so happy, it made me realize so much. I was a fool. I was so caught up in building the business, in the stress and the pressure, that I lost sight of what was important. I lost sight of you. Grant he's a distraction, a product of that world I thought I wanted. It's not real. What we had was real. I miss you. I miss us. I know I hurt you, but I'm willing to do anything to make it right. Please, can we just talk?" Ethan read the message twice, a bitter taste in his mouth. It was a masterwork of manipulation. Not once did she mention Serafina by name. She framed her sudden regret as an epiphany about him, not as a desperate, panicked reaction to his new partner's staggering status. She wasn't sorry for leaving him. She was sorry she'd left him before he'd traded up so spectacularly. It was the most Brenda thing she had ever done. He deleted the message without replying. The consequences for Brenda, however, were just beginning. The story of the confrontation at the gala, embellished and whispered through the city's elite circles, had cast her in a terrible light. She wasn't just an ambitious developer anymore. She was the cruel ex-wife who had tried to humiliate her unassuming former husband, only to be spectacularly shut down by a global icon. In a world built on image and perception, she had committed social suicide. Worse, the sudden spotlight on Ethan was bringing his past contributions to Walsh Properties into question. An influential architectural critic, intrigued by the story, wrote a blog post wondering why Ethan Cole, a man Serafina Dubois was championing, had such a thin portfolio for the last decade. He drew speculative but damning comparisons between Cole's early design style and the signature aesthetics of Walsh Properties' most successful buildings. The NDA prevented Ethan from speaking, but he didn't have to. The world was connecting the dots on its own. Whispers started among Brenda's investors. Was she really the visionary she claimed to be? Or was she just a ruthless marketer who had exploited her husband's talent and then cast him aside? The foundation of her carefully constructed empire, built on her singular image as a self-made titan, was beginning to crack. Grant Harrison, seeing the reputational damage splashing onto him, began to distance himself. A week after the gala, Ethan was in his apartment, sketching ideas for a new project, when his phone rang. It was an unknown number with a French country code. He answered cautiously. "Hello, medical. This is Jean-Luc Dubois." The voice was deep accent-scented and carried an unmistakable air of authority. "My daughter has told me a great deal about you. I believe it is time we met. I am in New York. My car will be at your address in 1 hour." It wasn't a request. It was a summons. The noise from the outside world had finally breached the walls of their quiet romance. Ethan was no longer just dealing with the ghost of his ex-wife. He was about to face the king. The hour felt like 10 minutes. Ethan barely had time to shower and change into his best suit, a charcoal grey, well-tailored, but a world away from the bespoke luxury the Dubois family inhabited. He stood at his window, watching the street below. Exactly 60 minutes after the call, a black Maybach, even more imposing than the Audi, pulled up to the curb. It was so sleek and silent, it seemed to absorb the sounds of the city around it. The ride to the meeting was a masterclass in silent intimidation. The chauffeur, a large man in a dark suit, didn't speak. The car's interior was a cocoon of buttery leather and polished wood. They bypassed the gleaming commercial towers of Midtown and headed for the quiet, old-money elegance of the Upper East Side, stopping in front of a magnificent limestone townhouse just off Fifth Avenue. This wasn't a hotel, it was a private residence, the Dubois family's New York home. Ethan was led through a foyer that was more like a private museum, with a Miro on one wall and a Giacometti sculpture in an alcove. He was shown into a library on the second floor. Bookshelves soared from floor to ceiling, filled with leather-bound volumes. A fire crackled in a marble fireplace, and in a high-backed armchair sat Jean-Luc Dubois. He was older than Ethan expected, perhaps in his late 60s, with a mane of silver hair and piercing blue eyes. He wore a simple cashmere sweater and tailored trousers, yet he exuded more power and elegance than anyone Ethan had ever met. He didn't rise, he simply gestured to the chair opposite him. "Mr. Cole, thank you for coming," he said, his voice the same deep baritone from the phone. His English was perfect, laced with only a faint aristocratic French accent. "Mr. Dubois, the pleasure is mine," Ethan replied, trying to keep his voice steady. Jean-Luc observed him for a long moment, his gaze sharp and analytical. It was the look of a man who could assess the value of a company, a gemstone, or a person in a single glance. "My daughter is very important to me," he began, his voice devoid of warmth. "She is the face of our house, the heart of our legacy, but she is also a young woman who has lived her life in a cage, albeit a gilded one. Her world is filled with sycophants, opportunists, and men who see her as a prize to be won." He paused, letting the words sink in. "You can understand then my concern. You appear in her life from nowhere, a man with a complicated past, a recent, and I hear, acrimonious divorce, a career that seems to have stalled for a decade." At each point was a precise, calculated jab. Jean-Luc had clearly done his homework. Ethan met his gaze. He would not be intimidated. "Respectfully, sir, my past is my own, but it's not a secret. My career didn't stall. It was rerouted to help build someone else's success. A mistake I don't intend to make again. As for your daughter, I didn't seek her out. I met a woman named Fina in an art gallery. I fell for her intelligence, her kindness, and her spirit. The rest, the name, the legacy, that is your world, not mine." A flicker of something surprised respect crossed Jean-Luc's face before it was gone. "A convenient sentiment," Jean-Luc said, his tone still skeptical. "Many men would say such things." "Perhaps," Ethan conceded. "But I have a question for you, Mr. Dubois. Your daughter told me that for the first time in her life she felt she could be herself with me, that she didn't have to be Serafina, or the icon, as her father does. That not mean anything to you?" The directness of the question seemed to disarm the older man. He leaned back in his chair, his fingers steepling in front of him. He was silent for a full minute. "My daughter, she has a gift for seeing the truth in things," Jean-Luc said, his voice softening almost imperceptibly. "In art, in people. It is why she is not only the face of our house, but its soul. She tells me you are an architect of some talent." "I like to think so," Ethan said. "Our family's philanthropic arm, the Dubois Foundation, is planning its next major project." Jean-Luc continued, shifting the topic. "A new museum for contemporary art and design in Brooklyn, a landmark project. The board has been reviewing proposals from the world's top firms. Snohetta, Renzo Piano, Herzog and de Meuron." He named the titans of the architectural world. "My daughter has suggested that we review a proposal from you." Ethan was stunned. Fina had done that. She had put his name alongside the gods of his profession. "That is an incredible honor," Ethan managed to say. "It is not an offer, Mr. Cole. It is a test." Jean-Luc clarified his voice, once again sharp. "The board is skeptical. You are unknown. Your firm is a one-man operation working out of an apartment. They see it as nepotism, a foolish whim of my daughter's. I have convinced them to grant you a chance. You will present your concept in 2 weeks. You will be judged not as my daughter's partner, but as an architect. If you fail, you will not only embarrass yourself, you will embarrass her. Do you understand the stakes? The pressure was immense. The opportunity was breathtaking. This was the commission of a lifetime, a chance to build something magnificent, to reclaim his name and his passion on the world stage. It was also a trial by fire, orchestrated by a man who was still deciding if he was worthy of his daughter. I understand perfectly, Ethan said, a fire he hadn't felt in years igniting in his chest. This was his language. This was his art. He wasn't afraid. He was energized. Good, Jean-Luc said, standing up, signaling the end of the meeting. Do not disappoint me. More importantly, do not disappoint her. As Ethan was shown out of the silent, opulent townhouse and back into the noise of the city, he felt a profound shift. The battle with Brenda was over. She had become a pathetic footnote in his past. The real challenge, the real future, was just beginning. He had 2 weeks to design a castle, not just to win the approval of the king, but to prove he was worthy of the queen. Meanwhile, Brenda's world was crumbling. The whispers about her business practices had grown into a roar. Crane's New York business ran a devastating expose titled The Ghost Architect of Walsh Properties. And while it couldn't prove anything definitively due to the NDA, it interviewed anonymous sources from her company and former colleagues of Ethan's from Somme. It painted a damning picture of a talented architect whose work was systematically appropriated by his then-wife. Investors grew nervous. A major pension fund that was the primary backer for her new flagship skyscraper project in Hudson Yards put a hold on their next round of funding, pending a full review of corporate governance and creative attribution. The project, Brenda's crowning achievement, ground to a halt. The banks started calling. Grant Harrison, who had co-invested publicly, announced he was pulling out of the deal and divesting from all interests connected to Walsh Properties, citing reputational risk. It was a brutal public betrayal, but one she had taught him well. Brenda was trapped in her Park Avenue penthouse, the panoramic views now feeling like a mockery. She was hemorrhaging money and, more importantly, status. She tried calling Ethan again this time, leaving a tearful, desperate voicemail begging him to release a statement, supporting her, claiming it was all a misunderstanding. She offered him money, a partnership, anything. Ethan listened to the voicemail, a sense of weary finality washing over him. He thought of the years he'd spent propping her up, the talent and energy he'd poured into her ambition. He thought of her sneering face at the gala, and then he thought of Fina's belief in him, of Jean-Luc's impossible, magnificent challenge. He deleted the message and got to work. He had a museum to design. The next 2 weeks were a blur of sleepless nights and caffeine-fueled creativity. Ethan's small apartment was transformed into a whirlwind of tracing paper foam core models and 3D renderings. The grey walls he had hidden behind for 2 years were now covered in vibrant sketches and bold concepts. The pilot light of his ambition had roared back to life, now a blazing inferno. He wasn't just designing a building, he was telling a story in glass, steel, and light. His concept for the Dubois Foundation Museum was audacious. Instead of a traditional monolithic structure, he envisioned a series of interconnected pavilions, each dedicated to a different medium: painting, sculpture, digital art, fashion, all flowing into a central sunlit atrium. The design was porous, intended to welcome the surrounding Brooklyn community in, rather than standing apart from it. The facade was a dynamic skin of photosensitive glass that would change opacity based on the time of day, making the building itself a living piece of art. He called it the Agora, a modern-day public square for creativity. Fina was his silent, supportive partner through it all. She respected his intense focus, bringing him food, making coffee, and just sitting quietly in the room, reading her presence, a calming anchor in his creative storm. She never offered an opinion on the design unless he asked, but when he did, her insights were brilliant. She spoke of how light would interact with a certain texture, or how a space would make a visitor feel, bringing the human element into his architectural vision. He realized her gift for seeing the truth in things was very real. They were building it together in a way. The day of the presentation arrived. The boardroom at the Dubois Foundation's headquarters was as intimidating as Jean-Luc's library. Ethan stood before a long, polished table occupied by a dozen stern-faced board members, including Jean-Luc Dubois himself, who sat at the head, his expression unreadable. Ethan was nervous, but as he began to speak, the nervousness melted away, replaced by pure passion. He didn't just present blueprints, he walked them through the experience. He spoke of light and shadow, of community and inspiration. He described how the museum would not just house art but foster it, with integrated studio spaces for emerging local artists. He showed them renderings of the building at dawn, at dusk, shimmering under the city lights. He poured every ounce of the talent Brenda had tried to bury into this one presentation. When he finished, the room was silent. The board members looked at each other, then at Jean-Luc. Ethan's heart pounded in his chest. An older woman on the board, known for her sharp critiques, spoke first. "It's radical," she said, though not with disdain. "It's a departure from the monumentalism we usually favor." "Monumentalism can be a fortress," Ethan replied calmly. "Art should be a gateway, not a fortress." Jean-Luc stared at the final rendering projected on the screen, the agora at night, glowing like a lantern in the Brooklyn skyline. He was silent for a long time. "My daughter," he finally said, his voice quiet but resonant, "told me you don't design buildings. She said you design feelings. Looking at this, I finally understand what she meant." He looked down the table at the other board members. "We would be fools to let this vision go." He then looked directly at Ethan. "The commission is yours, Mr. Cole. Congratulations." A wave of relief and elation so profound, it almost buckled Ethan's knees, washed over him. He had done it. He had won, not because of who he was dating, but because of who he was. The news of Cole Design winning the Dubois Foundation Commission sent shockwaves through the architecture and real estate worlds. It was the ultimate vindication. Architectural Digest ran a cover story on him, hailing him as the visionary in the wings, finally giving him the credit that was so long overdue. The final nail in Brenda Walsh's professional coffin came a week later. With her Hudson Yards project in ruins and her reputation shredded, Walsh Properties defaulted on a major loan. The bank seized her primary assets, including the Park Avenue penthouse. The empire Ethan had silently built was dismantled in a matter of months. The last Ethan heard, she had sold what was left of her company for pennies on the dollar and moved to a smaller condo in Florida, a pariah in the city she had fought so hard to conquer. There was no triumph in hearing the news, only a quiet sense of closure, like closing a book Kol Tsushuk he had finished long ago. 6 months later, Ethan stood with Fina on the construction site in Brooklyn. The foundation for the Agora was being poured, a tangible beginning for his dream. He was no longer in the grey apartment in Hell's Kitchen. He and Fina had found a beautiful loft in Soho, a space filled with light art and laughter. Fina, dressed in casual jeans and a sweater, her arm linked through his, looked out at the bustling site. The press still followed them sometimes, but it was different now. They were no longer the heiress and her mystery man. They were a power couple respected for their individual talents and the genuine partnership they so clearly shared. "It's going to be beautiful," she said, resting her head on his shoulder. "We're going to make it beautiful," he corrected her, squeezing her hand. He looked at her. His Fina, the woman, who had seen him when he was invisible, who had believed in him when he'd stopped believing in himself. She wasn't a status symbol or a prize. She was his partner, his home. He had lost a kingdom of glass and steel built on ambition and lies, only to gain an empire of his own built on a foundation of truth, respect, and love. The past was a scar, just like the painting in the gallery where they'd met. But looking at the future they were building together, he knew it was a beautiful, terrible scar that had, against all odds, led him here. And so Ethan Cole, the man who was once a ghost in his own life, stepped into the light, not as someone's shadow, but as a creator in his own right. His story isn't just about a shocking reveal at a fancy gala. It's a powerful reminder that true worth isn't measured by bank accounts or designer labels. It's measured by integrity, by passion, and by the courage to be true to yourself, even when the world has tried to erase you. Brenda learned the hard way that when you treat people as stepping stones, you'll eventually find yourself with no ground left to stand on. What did you think of Brenda's downfall? Was it karma or was it just business? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. If you enjoyed this story of vindication and unexpected love, please give this video a thumbs up, share it with someone who needs a little inspiration, and don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell so you never miss another real-life drama.